Celebrity historian Raffi Andonian is back to help us kick off the new year with a look back in time.
This is My KC Live.
Well, this month in history. Up next, we're ringing in the new year with some historic dates in January. Welcome back to My KC Live. There are so many incredible moments in history. So each month, we're going to take a look back at some notable historic events. And here to help us do that is celebrity historian Raffi Andonian. Thank you so much for being here today.
Of course. Happy New Year. Patriotic way to start it out. This year starts the 250th anniversary of the start of the American Revolution. So we're going to have the 250th anniversary going for the next 8 years.
There you go. That's great. Well, we're kicking things off, like you said, with a patriotic start. So walk me through some of the different things you brought here today, because we are loaded.
You got it. That's right. And January 10th is coming up.
Yep.
And January 10th is the anniversary of Tom Paine's Common Sense. Now, you might think, of course, of the Declaration of Independence. I got you a copy here in case you forgot.
Thank you.
And think about what you think about the Declaration of Independence. Opening it up, reading it aloud. You can open it up if you like. You got to tie it. Absolutely. That's why it's there. But before the Declaration of Independence, it was Tom Paine who wrote Common Sense. And you know what? That's really important.
Feels so formal right
now. That's
right.
But Paine's Common Sense was 47 pages. So he had a pamphlet that set the colonists on fire. He spoke before the Declaration of Independence existed. Earlier in the year, January 1776, he spoke in plain speak that these large philosophies that had been floating around and said that, you know, we should be out of the crown. We don't want the crown.
No.
The crown is something that he went against as a total philosophy in world history. One of my favorite lines in there, I'm paraphrasing, says something about an honest man is worth more than all the crown ruffians that ever lived.
All of them.
He really was anti-king. That's shaking up the social order. I got you.
I was going to say, now listen, you're not going to bring a crown in here and then not let me wear one too.
But you know what? In this case, though, he wanted to off their head. So I don't know if I want to wear a crown, but if you want to take the risk, we can do so.
I'll just wear it for a second, and because I would like to keep my head, I will now set this back down.
Now,
beautiful.
I go to a lot of Revolution events. I brought my even name tag from the Revolution conference I go to. I live this stuff. So this way, you know, I'm the real deal. But what I want you to know is that important thing about Tom Paine's Common Sense, think of it as like a bestseller. Okay. So he had 100,000 copies sold within a couple months, 500,000 by the end of the Revolution. Population is 2.5 million at that point in the colonies. To give you context to that, that's the equivalent today of one of the Lord of the Ring books, yeah, that's right. Or
you're like, that facial expression's accurate.
Or Grapes of Wrath, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. I looked up the Guinness Book of World Records for the most viral Instagram post, 75 million by Messi when they won the World Cup in Argentina.
There you go, yeah.
However, you would have to triple that number to have the equivalent scale of what he sold on the global scale, which is incredible to think about.
That is crazy, especially when you put it in perspective like that. Now, we got to talk about January 16th because we're talking Prohibition.
Well, you know what? The Founding Fathers loved to drink, so I brought the George Washington alcohol. This is actually from Mount Vernon. This is his recipe. He brewed beer and made whiskey. And the reason I bring that up is because that's a great way to talk about, for the Revolution, there was a rise against, a reaction against sort of drinking, if you will, over time that worked for a century and eventually came to Prohibition. January 16th is the anniversary that you're talking about in 1919. The state of Missouri is one of the states that approved on that date, that finished off the ratification of the Prohibition Amendment. The state of Kansas had already been dry for 40 years in the state, so we have a lot of ties to the history there. But what I want you to remember from Prohibition for us that's interesting, that still lasts with us today, is bartending. I brought here a mixer here, right? Now, what's interesting about bartending, believe it or not, now, you ever enjoy a nice cocktail?
Absolutely, I do, Raffi.
You like nice flavors in there?
I do.
Something like craft and something very flavorful, something different. That comes from the Prohibition period, believe it or not, because prior to Prohibition, you'd be drinking straight whiskey, maybe add a little sugar or something like that.
That's not for me.
And yes, that whiskey is clear because it wasn't even aged. That's actually authentic. But after Prohibition, what happens, or during Prohibition, because a lot of the liquor was bootleg and it was not that great, you would really want to flavor it, and that's when they come up with all these great different ways of flavoring alcohol. And we still live with some of those cocktail flavors today.
I had no idea that's how that happened. Okay, now we got it, because we've only got like a little bit of time left.
Let's go through it real
We're talking about the inauguration, because we got to talk about it.
That's right. Coming up on January 20th, inauguration, what I'd point out are a couple of traditions. We got George Washington here on the quarter. We got Thomas Jefferson, of course, responsible with Louisiana Purchase. And what's important is those presidents, for example, they started many inauguration traditions, such as making an inaugural address. George Washington started that himself. But the inauguration used to be in March because it took a long time for the government to get set up for the first time. but for the first time they do an election, but it caused all kinds of problems. The Civil War broke out. Abraham Lincoln over here, that was a problem, and they didn't know what to do during secession. Later on with FDR here on the dime, the Depression started, the Great Depression happened. They had this lame duck president sitting there, so inauguration moved to January as a result of that, plus technology allowed it because you didn't need as much time to count the votes. Now, speaking of inauguration, one of the traditions that started was our friend President Truman, of course, from right here in Missouri. Truman's was the first inauguration address to be televised, believe it or not. Truman over here was the guy that did that. Now, what's important, of course, also on Inauguration Day this year on the 20th is MLK Day. Right?
MLK Day.
So Truman, his big impact in the context of MLK Day was creating the Committee on Civil Rights, which was created as a way to evaluate how civil rights happening before the civil rights movement, before MLK was really popular. And so Truman's Committee on Civil Rights listed a list of 4 freedoms, eventually led to him desegregating the military by executive order, Truman's impact on civil rights. And the reason I point that out here is not only because he's local, but it's a great way to see how our local history ties with MLK Day's themes. And that helped validate the dream that Tom Paine put forward, because he said we have an opportunity to remake the world with pure principles. A guy like Truman is coming through. Does that You follow
yes, listen, I'm following you now. We only got 30 seconds left, but we got to talk about January 29th. Kansas joins the Union.
So speaking of fulfilling the dream, Kansas starts in a very bloody way, but of course it's part of Louisiana Purchase. There's Jefferson, and how about Abraham Lincoln? He gets his rise opposing what was taking place in Kansas. Bleeding Kansas, as it's known, you had pro-slavery forces and anti-slavery forces that were fighting to create a constitution that was either pro-slavery and anti-slavery. Some people may have heard of John Brown's raid in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Well, it started in Kansas. He had a big bloody kind of encounter in Kansas. As a part of that, Bleeding Kansas spilled into the Civil War, became a state in 1861. On January 29th, and Abraham Lincoln was really focused on that before he was president. That's how he started his political career. And the last thing I'll point out is that this is a pen that I have made from the wood of a witness tree that Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address at the Gettysburg Battlefield in 1863, 2 years after Kansas became a state, halfway through the Civil War. And the reason that matters is because in the Gettysburg Address, he talked about a new birth of freedom. And think about the new birth of freedom in the context of our patriotic New Year, in the context of Tom Paine's Common Sense, Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, Truman's Committee on Civil Rights, that he was talking about delivering on the American promise. And that happened because he was inspired by what happened in Kansas and concerned over the fight between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces several years prior, which inspired him to join politics, which then led him to become president. And that's the impact Kansas had on the entire nation.
Oh my gosh. All right, Raffi, you just came in and like that was a mic drop situation. So all of those important dates we now know happening in January. We know some of the amazing information behind it. Thank you so much for being here today. Absolutely. All right, guys. Well, you can hire Raffi, the celebrity historian, for a private tour for yourself or your group at raffisregulars.com, or follow his adventures across the country on Instagram at celebrity_historian.